A single act of mercy can defy a world of hatred. In the brutal winter of 1877, Sarah Whitfield, a young widow haunted by loss, clings to a remote Wyoming mail station, her only tether to a husband slain in ambush. When she stumbles upon a wounded Lakota warrior, her choice to save him sparks a bond that could shatter two warring worlds or forge a legend. Will her compassion rewrite history or seal her fate? Dive into this tale of courage and connection. Subscribe now, share where you're listening from, and uncover how one woman's heart reshaped the frontier. What secrets lie in the snow? Stay to find out. The Wyoming plains stretched endlessly under a sky heavy with gray, the kind of gray that swallowed hope and spat out silence. Winter of 1877 had sunk its teeth deep, cloaking the land in a shroud of snow that muffled even the howl of the wind. Sarah Whitfield, barely 24, stood in the doorway of her husband's stagecoach and mail station, a weathered outpost of wood and grit that clung to the edge of nowhere. Her breath hung in the air, a fleeting ghost against the cold that gnawed at her bones. 8 months had passed since Thomas's blood stained the earth, cut down in an ambush on a supply run. The station was all she had left of him, a stubborn relic of his dreams, now her prison. The station creaked under the weight of the blizzard, its timbers groaning like an old man's bones. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and loneliness. Sarah's hands, rough from chopping wood and mending fences, clutched a tin cup of weak tea, its warmth a faint rebellion against the frost, creeping through the walls. She was a shadow of the woman Thomas had loved, her face gaunt from a diet of salted beef and memories. Her eyes, once bright as the prairie sun, now carried the dull ache of a life hollowed out. The station's single room was a shrine to absence. Thomas's coat still hung by the door. His boots stood sentinel by the hearth, and a battered chest held letters he'd never sent. Outside, the snow fell relentlessly, piling high against the station's walls, sculpting drifts that could bury a horse. The world was a canvas of white, broken only by the skeletal silhouettes of pines clawing at the sky. Sarah pulled Thomas's coat tighter around her shoulders, its wool heavy with his scent, and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit like a fist, stealing her breath, but she needed to check the corral where her only horse, a grizzled mare named Juniper, stamped nervously in the snow. The animal was her lifeline, her last tie to the world beyond this frozen wasteland. The silence was a living thing, pressing against her ears, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk or the soft crunch of her boots. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the weight of everything unsaid. Every laugh Thomas would never share. Every promise the frontier had broken. She'd heard the whispers in Cheyenne, the tales of Lakota raids, of blood spilled on these plains. They said the Lakota had taken Thomas, though no one knew for sure. The uncertainty was a blade in her gut, twisting with every step she took in this land that cared nothing for her grief. Sarah knelt by the corral, checking the posts for cracks. The wind carried a low moan, not the storm's voice, but something older, deeper, as if the plains themselves were mourning. She stood, brushing snow from her knees, and scanned the horizon. Nothing but white, endless and unforgiving. The station was a speck in this vastness, a defiant dot of human will against a wilderness that devoured the weak. She'd learned to survive here, to coax life from frozen soil, to keep the fire burning through nights that felt eternal. But survival wasn't living. It was just enduring. Back inside, she stoked the fire, the logs hissing as they surrendered to the flames. The station's walls were lined with shelves holding tin cans and a few dried herbs, her meager arsenal against starvation. A single letter, yellowed and unopened, lay on the table, its ink smudged from her fingers, brushing over Thomas's handwriting. She couldn't bear to read it. Not yet. It was the last piece of him, and opening it felt like letting him go. She sat by the hearth, the firelight casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the room. The storm raged on outside, a beast clawing at the station, but inside, the silence was louder. Sarah's thoughts drifted to the stories she'd heard. Tales of Lakota warriors, shadows in the snow, their names spoken in hushed fear. She didn't know if they'd killed Thomas, but the doubt was a poison seeping into her dreams. She gripped the rifle above the hearth, its cold steel a reminder of the world's cruelty. The night stretched ahead, long and merciless. Sarah Whitfield sat alone, a woman carved by loss, waiting for a dawn that might never come. The fire in the hearth spat embers, its glow a frail shield against the Wyoming night. Outside, the blizzard had softened to a mournful whisper, the snow settling like ash over a grave. Dawn crept in, gray and hesitant, painting the frost-crusted windows with a sickly light. Sarah rose, her limbs heavy with sleeplessness, and pulled on Thomas's coat. The air bit at her face as she stepped onto the porch, the cold a living thing that clawed through her layers. She needed to check the corral again, to ensure Juniper hadn't broken free in the storm's chaos. The world was a frozen sea, the plains stretching unbroken to the horizon, where pines stood like sentinels guarding secrets. Sarah's boots crunched through the fresh snow, each step a defiance against the wilderness that threatened to swallow her whole. She reached the corral, her breath clouding in the still air, and found Juniper pacing, her eyes wild with unease. The mare's unease mirrored Sarah's own, a prickling sense that the silence held something more than wind. As she turned back toward the station, her gaze caught on a dark smear against the snow, a jagged slash of red near the creek that snaked through her land. It wasn't the clean kill of a wolf or the spill of a deer's blood. It was too deliberate, too fresh. Her heart kicked against her ribs, a warning drumbeat. Every instinct screamed to retreat, to bolt the door and clutch the rifle. The plains were no place for curiosity. Survivors didn't poke at shadows. But something in that crimson stain pulled her forward, a thread of compulsion she couldn't cut. She followed the trail, her boots sinking deep, the snow sucking at her steps like quicksand. The blood led to the creek, its surface a cracked mirror of ice. There, half hidden by a tangle of bare willows, lay a man, sprawled face down in the snow. His buckskin leggings were tattered, one leg mangled in the cruel jaws of a bear trap. A dark pool spread beneath him, soaking the snow red. Sarah froze, her breath hitching. He was Lakota, his black hair fanned out like spilled ink, his skin copper dark against the white. The stories flooded back. Raids, ambushes, the shadow of Custer's Fall. This was the enemy, the specter that haunted every settler's firelight tales. Her hand twitched toward the knife at her belt, fear a cold weight in her gut. She could turn back, let the snow claim him. No one would know. But his chest rose, a shallow shudder, and his fingers twitched, clawing weakly at the frozen ground. His eyes, half open, caught hers. Dark, glassy, and raw with pain. They weren't the eyes of a monster. They were Thomas's eyes, pleading in the dark of her nightmares. "Damn it," she muttered, her voice a puff of frost. She knelt, the snow soaking her knees, and pried at the trap's jaws. The steel was unyielding, its teeth sunk deep into his flesh. Her hands shook, not from cold, but from the madness of what she was doing. The trap sprang open with a snap, and the man groaned, a sound that cut through the silence like a blade. Blood pulsed from his leg, mixing with the snow. Sarah's mind raced. Leave him. and the wolves would finish what the trap started. Save him, and she might invite death into her home. She looped her arms under his weight a dead anchor against the ground. He was tall, lean, but heavy with muscle and unconsciousness. Her boots slipped in the snow as she dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, towards the station. The 50 yards felt like a mile, her lungs burning, her back screaming. Blood smeared a grim trail behind them, a scarlet thread stitching her fate to his. She reached the porch, her strength nearly spent, and hauled him over the threshold. The door slammed shut, sealing out the wilderness but trapping her with a stranger who could be her undoing. Inside, the firelight cast his face in stark relief. High cheekbones, a jaw sharp as flint, and a jagged wound at his temple, crusted with blood. His breathing was ragged, a threadbare rhythm. Sarah stood over him, her hands trembling, the rifle still mounted above the hearth, a silent judge. She'd crossed a line, dragging this man from the snow. The plains didn't forgive such choices, as the fire hissed and the wind moaned outside. Sarah Whitfield faced the truth. She'd invited a storm into her sanctuary, and there was no turning back. The Lakota warrior lay sprawled by the hearth, his blood seeping into the rough planks of her floor, a grim stain spreading like guilt. The Wyoming dawn offered no mercy, its pale light slicing through the station's frost-rimed windows, illuminating the man who could be her death. Sarah's hands shook as she stood over him, the weight of her choice heavier than the rifle above the hearth. She'd dragged him from the snow, but now what? Every creak of the station's timbers felt like a judgment, every gust outside a warning of the world she'd defied. She knelt beside him, her breath shallow, and studied his wounds. The bear trap had torn his leg to ribbons, the flesh jagged and oozing, but the bullet wound in his side was worse, a raw, gaping hole that wept dark blood. Sarah's stomach churned, not from the gore, but from the insanity of her actions. This was no neighbor she was tending, no miner or trapper. He was Lakota, a specter from the tales that haunted Cheyenne's saloons, tales of raids and scalps, of men like Thomas cut down without mercy. Yet here she was, her hands poised to save what the plains had tried to kill. Sarah fetched a bucket of snow, melting it over the fire until steam curled like spirits in the air. She rummaged through Thomas's chest, pulling out a sewing kit, a rusted razor, and a half-empty bottle of bourbon, its amber glow catching the firelight. Her fingers, calloused from years of toil, fumbled with the needle. She'd stitched wounds before, Thomas's hand once, gashed by a slipped axe, but this was different. This was a man whose people might have spilled her husband's blood. The thought was a splinter in her mind, sharp and unyielding, yet she couldn't look away from his face, etched with pain even in unconsciousness. She cut away his tattered buckskin shirt, the fabric stiff with blood and frost. His torso was a map of scars, old, faded lines crisscrossing his skin, each one a story of survival. The bullet wound was fresh, angry, its edges blue and swollen. Sarah poured bourbon into the gash, the sharp scent stinging her nose as the man's body arched, a low moan tearing from his throat. His eyes flickered open, black as coal, and for a moment, they locked on hers. Wild, uncomprehending, but human. Then they rolled back, and he was gone again, lost to pain or fever. "Stay with me," she whispered, though she didn't know why. Her voice sounded foreign in the quiet station, a plea to a stranger who couldn't hear. She threaded the needle, her hands trembling as she pierced his skin, each stitch a battle against her fear. The wound on his leg was next, the trap's teeth having chewed through muscle. She cleaned it with melted snow, the water turning pink, then red as she worked. Every flinch of his body, Every ragged breath was a reminder of the line she'd crossed. If a cavalry patrol found him here, they'd brand her a traitor. If his people came looking, she might not live to explain. The fire roared, the station growing stifling as sweat beaded on her brow. She worked in a trance, her fear channeled into focus, her hands moving with a precision born of necessity. The bullet was lodged deep, too deep for her to reach without risking more damage. She bound the wound with strips torn from an old petticoat, the fabric soft against the brutality of his injuries. His temple gash needed stitches too, and she sewed it shut, her needle weaving through blood-matted hair. When she finished, she slumped back, her hands stained red, her body trembling with exhaustion. She sat by the hearth, the fire's glow casting shadows that danced like specters across the walls. The man's breathing steadied, a fragile rhythm, but each rise of his chest felt like a countdown. What had she done? She'd saved a life, but at what cost? The rifle above the hearth gleamed, its barrel a cold promise of protection or betrayal. She could end this now, one shot to erase her mistake. But the memory of Thomas, broken and alone, stayed her hand. Had anyone shown him mercy? The question was a weight, pressing against her heart. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the threat of the plains, a land that forgave no weakness. Sarah's eyes drifted to the stranger, his face softened in the firelight. No longer just a warrior, but a man, vulnerable and broken. She'd chosen compassion over fear, but the war within her raged on. The station, her refuge, was now a battlefield, and the fight was just beginning. The fire's glow flickered across the Lakota warrior's face, his steady breaths a fragile thread tying Sarah Whitfield to the choice she'd made. The Wyoming morning was a cold, gray shroud, the snow outside piling higher, sealing them in a world of their own making. Sarah sat by the hearth, her hand still stained with his blood, her mind a storm of doubt and defiance. The man stirred, his eyes fluttering open, black as obsidian, and sharp with awareness. He didn't speak, but his gaze pinned her, a silent question hanging in the air. Why had she saved him? Sarah rose, her movements slow, deliberate, like a deer stepping through a wolf's territory. She fetched a tin cup of water, her hand steady despite the weight of his stare. He took it, his fingers brushing hers, hot with the first signs of fever. The contact was a spark, a fleeting jolt that reminded her of the humanity beneath his scars. She retreated to the table, her sanctuary within the station, and watched him drink, his throat working against the silence. The air was thick with unspoken tension, a fragile truce between two souls caught in a land that thrived on conflict. He gestured toward the bucket, a slight tilt of his head, and Sarah understood. She refilled the cup, her boot scuffing the floorboards. As she handed it back, he spoke a single word, low and guttural. Wakan. His voice was like the wind over the plains, raw and unyielding. She didn't know its meaning, but it felt like a gift, a crack in the wall between them. Sarah, she said softly, pointing to herself. His lips moved, testing the sound, mangling it into Sarah. The attempt was awkward, human, and it broke something in her, a small, guarded piece of her heart. The day wore on, the storm outside a distant roar. Sarah busied herself with chores, stoking the fire, mending a tear in her apron, but her eyes kept drifting to him. He sat propped against the wall, his strength returning in fits and starts. His hands, long and calloused, traced the air, mimicking the gallop of a horse. He pointed to the floor, then to a lump of charcoal by the hearth. Sarah hesitated, then handed it to him. He knelt, wincing as his wounds protested, and began to draw on the rough planks. A horse took shape, its lines fierce and fluid, mane flowing like a river, eyes wild with spirit. He tapped his chest, then the drawing, and spoke again. Tashunka. His voice broke, heavy with loss. Sarah's breath caught. She knew that pain, the hollow ache of losing what tethered you to the world. Thomas's face flashed in her mind, his laugh silenced by the plains. She knelt beside the warrior, her fingers hovering over the drawing. Juniper, she said, her voice barely a whisper, pointing to the corral outside. His eyes followed, understanding dawning in their depths. They were strangers, enemies by the world's reckoning. But grief was a language they both spoke. He pointed to a scar on his chest, a jagged line like a lightning strike. With a sharp gesture, he mimicked a knife slash, then growled, low and guttural, the sound of a bear. Another scar, a puckered mark on his shoulder, came with a pantomime of an arrow's flight. Each mark was a story, etched in flesh, a map of a life forged in battle and survival. Sarah's hand moved before she could stop it, tracing a faint scar on his arm. His eyes snapped to hers, and for a moment, the air crackled with tension. Then he nodded, a silent permission, and pointed to another, sharing his history in a language older than words. This story of scars and shared loss is one of many hidden in the frontier's shadow. If it moves you, hit that subscribe button and share where you're listening from. It keeps these tales alive. Sarah watched him, the charcoal horse a testament to their fragile bond. He was no longer just a warrior, but Wakan Sita, Shadow Raven, a man whose pain mirrored her own. The station's walls seemed to shrink, the space between them charged with a new understanding. But outside, the plains waited, vast and unforgiving. And Sarah knew their truce was a fleeting thing. The world beyond the door would not let them forget who they were, or what they stood to lose. The Wyoming dusk settled over the station like a heavy cloak, the fire's glow a frail bulwark against the creeping dark. Sarah Whitfield sat at her table, the charcoal horse on the floor, a silent testament to the bond she'd forged with Wakan Sika, the Lakota warrior whose life she'd tethered to her own. His fever had eased, his wounds knitting with a resilience that spoke of a life carved from hardship. But the air in the station was taut, a bowstring drawn tight, as if the plains themselves were waiting for the snap. Sarah moved through her chores with mechanical precision, boiling snow for water, checking the bandages on Wakan's side. But her eyes kept darting to the windows, where the snow glowed faintly under a rising moon. The silence outside was no longer just the absence of sound. It was a predator, coiled and watchful. She'd heard the tales in Cheyenne, bounty hunters prowling the plains, men who'd kill for a fistful of coin, men who saw a Lakota's life as worth less than a buffalo hide. Wakan's presence in her station was a lit fuse, and she felt the burn. He sat by the hearth, his back to the wall, his gaze distant yet piercing, as if he could see through the timbers to the dangers beyond. His strength was returning, each movement more deliberate, less pained. He'd taken to watching her, not with suspicion, but with a quiet intensity, like a hawk studying the grass for movement. When she changed his bandages, his eyes followed her hands, noting every careful stitch, every dab of boiled herbs. He didn't flinch, but his silence spoke louder than words, a gratitude tempered by the knowledge of the risk she'd taken. The seventh day dawned clear, the storm's fury spent, leaving a world of stark, blinding white. Sarah stepped outside to gather firewood, the cold biting through her coat like a blade. The plains stretched endlessly, the horizon a knife edge where sky met snow. She was stacking logs against the station's wall when a sound cut through the stillness. A sharp, metallic ring, like a spur striking stone. Her blood froze. She dropped the wood, her heart hammering, and crept to the edge of the clearing, hiding behind a gnarled pine. Through the branches, she saw them. 3 riders, their figures dark against the sun, moving slowly up the valley pass. The leader was a man whose face she knew, though she wished she didn't. Silas Boone, his buffalo coat tattered, his eyes cold as the ice on the creek. She'd seen him once in Cheyenne, months after Thomas's death, his laugh grating as he bragged about a supply run gone wrong. The memory was a fist in her gut. Boone had been there when Thomas fell, she was sure of it. His companions were shadows of him, one hulking, his rifle clutched like a talisman, the other wiry, his gaze skittering like a spooked horse. Sarah bolted back to the station, her boots slipping in the snow. She burst through the door, her face a mask of panic. Wakan was on his feet in an instant, his hand instinctively grazing his wounded side. He saw her fear and needed no words. Moving to the window, he peered through a frost-free patch, his body tensing as he spotted the riders. His eyes met hers, blazing with a warrior's instinct, and he pointed to the rifle above the hearth. The message was clear: arm him, and he'd fight. Sarah's mind reeled. If Boone found a Lakota here, he'd kill without question. And her, for harboring him. She didn't want to imagine. She shook her head, her voice a hoarse whisper. Hide. She pointed to the coal cellar, its trapdoor hidden under a bearskin rug. Wakan's jaw tightened, his pride warring with her plea. But he nodded, a single sharp motion, and lowered himself into the dark, musty hole. Sarah slammed the trapdoor shut, dragging the rug over it, her hands trembling as she smoothed it flat. The hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the low growl of men's voices. She straightened, wiping sweat from her brow, and forced her face into a mask of weary calm. A knock rattled the door, heavy and demanding, and Boone's voice slithered through the wood. "Ma'am, we see your smoke. Need a word and some warmth." Sarah's heart thundered, but she lifted the latch, her sanctuary now a trap. The plains had found her, and the shadows were closing in. Silas Boone stood on her porch, his buffalo coat dusted with snow, his eyes like chipped flint, scanning the station's dim interior. Behind him, his 2 men loomed, their breath clouding in the Wyoming chill, rifles slung low but ready. The air crackled with menace, the kind that hung over a saloon before a brawl. Sarah forced her hands to steady, smoothing her apron, as if it could armor her against the threat. "Come in," she said, her voice a thin thread of calm. "I've got tea, not much else." Boone stepped inside, his boots heavy on the floorboards, his men trailing like wolves. The station shrank under their presence, the walls closing in as they huddled near the hearth. Boone's gaze roamed, sharp and predatory, lingering on the bearskin rug that hid Wakan Sicha in the coal cellar below. "Mighty lonesome out here, ma'am," he said, his voice low, oily. "A woman alone, no man to keep the wolves at bay." He picked up the tin cup Wakan had used, turning it over in his calloused hands. Sarah's pulse hammered. Had she missed a drop of blood? A strand of black hair? "No wolves," she said, pouring water into the kettle with deliberate care. "Just me and the snow." Her mind raced, mapping every inch of the room for signs of her secret. The charcoal horse on the floor was smudged, barely visible in the firelight, but Boone's eyes missed nothing. He set the cup down, too slowly, and leaned closer. "Heard tell of trouble nearby. A Lakota war party hit a convoy on the Cheyenne River. They're looking for someone. A chief, they say. You seen anything unusual?" Sarah's throat tightened, but she met his gaze, her face a mask of weary indifference. "Nothing but deer tracks and frost. I keep to myself." The lie tasted like ash, but she held it firm. Boone's lips twitched, not a smile, but a predator's grimace. His wiry companion, Billy, shivered, muttering about savages lurking in the hills. The hulking man grunted, his eyes dull but fixed on her. Below, in the cellar's damp dark, Wakan was still, his ears straining to catch the muffled voices. His hand rested on a hidden knife, his warrior's instinct coiled tight, ready to erupt if Sarah's voice broke into a scream. Boone paced, his boots thudding too close to the rug. "Fine place for a hideout," he mused, nudging the rug's edge with his toe. "Your man's work, this rug." Sarah nodded, her voice steady despite the knot in her gut. "Thomas, hunted it himself, keeps the floor warm." Boone's eyes narrowed, sensing the lie's thin edge. Strange place for it, right in the middle. "You don't trip?" Sarah forced a shrug. "I'm used to it." The kettle hissed, breaking the tension. Sarah poured tea, her hands trembling only slightly, and offered it with a tight smile. "No coffee, but Thomas left some whiskey. Care for a dram?" Boone's eyes gleamed, greed warring with suspicion. He nodded, and she fetched the bottle, pouring 3 glasses with a steadiness that belied her fear. The men drank, their gruff thanks filling the small space. But Boone's gaze lingered, probing, as if he could smell the truth beneath her calm. As they drained their glasses, a scrap of paper slipped from Boone's coat, fluttering to the floor. Sarah's heart stopped. It was a bounty poster, crumpled and stained, bearing a crude sketch of a raven. Wakan's raven, matching the deerskin charm tucked in his leggings. She froze, her mind screaming. He was no ordinary warrior. He was a chief, hunted, worth a fortune dead or alive. Boone didn't notice the paper, his eyes still scanning the room. Sarah kicked it under the table, her boot silent, and forced her voice to stay even. "Deadwood trails north, past the ridge. Stay clear of the creek, it's iced over." Boone tipped his hat, his gaze lingering too long on the rug. "You take care, ma'am. This land's no place for a woman alone." The threat hung heavy as they left, their hoofbeats fading into the snow. Sarah bolted the door, her knees buckling. She threw back the rug, lifting the cellar door. Wakan climbed out, his eyes burning with a question he didn't voice. The poster's raven loomed in Sarah Whitfield's mind, a shadow of the danger now stalking them both. The Wyoming night was a cold, black veil, the station's walls creaking under the weight of secrets. Wakan Sika stood by the hearth, his silhouette sharp against the firelight, his eyes burning with a warrior's resolve. The bounty poster had named him a chief, a prize worth blood. And Sarah knew Silas Boone would return, his greed sharper than any blade. She clutched Thomas's rifle, its weight a cold anchor, as the plains outside whispered of coming violence. The fragile truce within the station was fraying, and the world beyond the door was closing in. Days bled into one another, the snow piling higher, sealing them in a brittle cocoon. Wakan's wounds healed with a speed that defied the brutality of his injuries, his movements growing fluid, purposeful. He paced the station's confines, a caged panther, his gaze often drifting to the window, where the plains stretched like a frozen sea. Sarah taught him fragments of her language. Fire, snow, safe. And he taught her in return, his hands tracing the air to mimic a hawk's flight or a horse's gallop. Each word, each gesture, was a bridge across the chasm of their worlds, but the shadow of Boone's threat hung heavy. On the 9th morning, as a crimson dawn bled over the horizon, Wakan froze mid-step, his head cocked like a wolf catching a scent. Sarah felt it too, a prickle along her spine, a shift in the air's weight. She joined him at the window, her breath fogging the glass. There, cresting the valley pass, were 6 riders, their figures dark against the snow. Boone led them, his buffalo coat unmistakable, his men fanning out like vultures circling a kill. Torches flickered in their hands, their intent clear as the ice on the creek. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs, fear a cold fist in her gut. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Wakan's eyes met hers, steady and unyielding. He pointed to the rifle, then to himself. But Sarah shook her head. "The cellar," she urged, pointing to the trap door. Wakan's jaw tightened, his pride a living thing, and he spoke, his English halting but fierce. "No. Hiding." The words were a vow, a line drawn in the dirt. Sarah's fear hardened into resolve. She gripped the Winchester, its barrel cold against her palm, and nodded. They'd face this together. Boone's voice shattered the silence, raw and commanding. "Sarah Thompson, send out the Sioux chief or we burn this place to ash." The name hit like a bullet. Wakan was no mere warrior, but a leader, a legend. Sarah glanced at him, his face carved from stone, unflinching. She threw open the window, the cold rushing in, and shouted back, "This is my land! He's my guest! Cross that threshold and you'll die here!" Her voice rang clear, defiance cutting through the morning chill. Boone laughed, a cruel, guttural sound, and raised a torch. His men spread out, encircling the station, their shadows long and jagged on the snow. Wakan moved to the door, his hand on the knife at his belt, his posture that of a man who'd faced death and walked away. Sarah stood beside him, the rifle steady, her heart a war drum. The air was thick with the promise of blood, the moment teetering on a razor's edge. Boone signaled, and a torch arced toward the station's thatched roof, its flame a hungry beast. Then a deep rumble rolled through the valley, like thunder, born of the earth itself. Boone's men froze, their eyes darting to the ridge above. A single rider crested the horizon, silhouetted against the blood-red sun, followed by another, then dozens, then hundreds. Lakota warriors flooded the slopes, their disciplined silence a weapon sharper than steel. Their horses' hooves churned the snow, their lances glinting like shards of ice. Boone's torch fell from his hand, extinguished in the snow, his face pale as death. Wakan stepped forward, his presence a command that silenced the wind. The warriors roared, a sound that shook the plains, their salute to their chief, Wakan Sika, Shadow Raven, leader of 1,000. He raised a hand, and the roar ceased, the valley holding its breath. In measured English, he spoke to Boone, his voice a blade wrapped in calm. "You hunt gold, but find only greed. Leave these hills. Never return, or the land will drink your blood." Boone's men dropped their weapons, their bravado crumbling, and fled, their horses' hoofbeats a frantic retreat. Sarah stood, the rifle still in her hands, as the plains reclaimed their silence. The fight was over, but the cost was yet to be counted. The Wyoming dusk burned crimson, painting the snow in shades of blood and fire. Wakan Sika, Shadow Raven, stood at the station's threshold, his silhouette a pillar against the fading light. The Lakota warriors lined the ridge, their lances glinting like stars, their presence a vow etched in the frozen earth. Silas Boone and his men were gone, their hoofbeats swallowed by the valley. But Sarah felt no relief. The weight of what she'd done, saving a chief, defying death, pressed heavily on her heart, a stone too large to carry alone. The station was quiet now, the fire a low murmur, its embers casting long shadows across the floorboards. Wakan turned to her, his eyes no longer those of a wounded stranger, but of a leader, tempered by gratitude and resolve. He spoke, his voice steady, the English she'd taught him now a bridge between their worlds. "You gave me life," he said, each word deliberate, like a stone placed in a river. "This place, your home, is Wakan, sacred." The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning, a shield against the world's cruelty. Sarah's throat tightened. She set the rifle against the wall, its barrel cold and useless now. The station, her prison of grief, felt different, its walls no longer just timber, but a fortress of choices made in defiance of fear. Wakan gestured to the plains beyond the door, where his people waited, their horses stamping in the snow. "My path is there," he said, his gaze steady but softened by something unspoken. "Yours is here." He paused, then reached for her hand, his touch brief but warm, a silent debt acknowledged. "Winyan Shichamna," he said, his voice low, reverent. "Woman who keeps compassion." The name settled on her like a mantle, heavy yet grounding. She understood its weight, a promise, a protection. No Lakota would raise a hand against this place, not while Wakan Sika's word held. He stepped outside, his boots crunching in the snow, and a warrior approached, leading a black pony, its eyes wild and knowing. Wakan mounted with a grace that belied his wounds, his figure a dark cutout against the fiery sky. He looked back once, his eyes meeting hers, and nodded, a farewell that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Then he rode toward the ridge, his warriors parting like a river around a stone, and was gone. Sarah stood alone on the porch, the cold biting through her coat, the silence no longer oppressive but vast, alive with possibility. The station loomed behind her, its weathered planks a testament to survival. Not just hers, but Thomas's, Wakan's, and the fragile bond that had rewritten her fate. She walked to the corral, where Juniper snorted, her breath a white cloud in the dusk. The plains stretched endlessly, their beauty sharp and unforgiving. But Sarah no longer felt small against them. She was part of their story now, woven into their harsh, unyielding fabric. Inside, she knelt by the table, the charcoal horse still faintly visible on the floor. She opened Thomas's chest, her fingers brushing the unopened letter she'd avoided for months. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but it was his hand, his heart. She didn't read it, not yet. Instead, she carried it outside, the snow crunching under her boots, and knelt by the porch steps. With a small trowel, she dug through the frozen earth, her hand steady despite the cold. She buried the letter there, a quiet offering to the land that had taken so much and given her this moment. The station stood behind her, no longer a cage, but a beacon, its smoke curling into the sky like a prayer. Sarah was no longer just the widow of Thomas Whitfield, clinging to a ghost. She was Winyan Shichamna, a name that would echo through the plains, carried by 1,000 warriors who knew her mercy. The snow fell softly now, dusting the station in white, and Sarah felt a peace she hadn't known since Thomas's laughter filled these walls. The frontier was cruel, but it had carved her anew, a woman who'd faced death, chosen compassion, and claimed her place in its wild heart. As the stars pierced the Wyoming sky, Sarah stood, her breath mingling with the night. The plains were silent, but their silence was no longer empty. It was a legacy, hers and Wakan's, a story of courage that would outlast the snow, the blood, and the years. Sarah and Wakan Sika's tale weaves a thread of courage through the brutal Wyoming winter, proving compassion can bridge even the bloodiest divides. What did their story stir in you? Did Sarah's defiance or Wakan's honor resonate most? Share your thoughts below and tell us where you're listening from. Your voice keeps these frontier legends alive. We're grateful for your time for joining us in this journey through a world of snow and sacrifice. Until the next tale, when the plains call us back to uncover another hidden history, stay curious and keep the fire burning. We'll meet again under these wide, wild skies.